Welcome to Naked Words. Thank you for coming down to Naked Words once again. At the Rathskeller. And then, after that, at the Rathskeller. But tonight, we have a whole different situation going. We have books of fiction. Here's a really great one. Oh, I think. Isn't that true? Oh, it's really, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm going out on a limb there. At the Rathskeller. But anyway, is a biography of the poet in Montana. Tonight, I think, as we all do in Montana. This, I think, will be one of the finest readings we've had here in our series. And what we're going to do is, a tantalizing teaser there. As always, it's Naked Words, so if you have something to say, you will also be welcomed to sign up on the sheet here at the central table with Casey, the keeper of the sacred sign-up sheet. So let's have a really warm round of applause for I guess we'll get started here. Naked Words tonight. This just in. The selected poems of Grace Stone Coates. Has anyone ever heard of Grace Stone Coates? Martinsdale inhabitant, Montana, famous writer from way back. These are lost poems that have been republished just recently by Drumlummon Institute. My friend, Rick Newby, spearheads this institute, and this is a great project. She wrote a couple of collections of short stories back in the 30s and got wide acclaim, really. Very well known for her time. Kind of forgotten, particularly the poems. Some of the prose has been put back into print fairly recently. University of Nebraska Press recently put out a collection of poems called Black Cherries, I believe. It's really good stuff. Puts you right back there in Martinsdale, back in the 30s and 20s. So, local woman made good. I'm glad to see you out here tonight for another local character who we're going to celebrate tonight. And that's why we're here, to listen to Dave Ames. Remember True Lovin' the Woolly Bugger? With that fine cover by Biff Carlins, who now is a denizen of Oklahoma. Yeah, he's down there in fundamentalist country. I talked to him about a year ago on the phone, and he was having a little trouble with the fundamentalists, but that's not surprising. I know. He's very intimate with the whole Jesus story. Well, I don't need to introduce you to Dave Ames tonight. What are you going to read from tonight? You got some short stories, right? Right. But I do want to mention one thing. I just happened to stumble on this, and this is called An Invitation. It's a preface to his story on bone fishing, juju travel in True Lovin' the Woolly Bugger. The top 10 reasons to go bone fishing. 10. You have to go. The bonefish won't come to you. Number 9, it's cold out. It's cold here. It's warm there. Number 8, adrenaline. It's legal and it's free. 7, Bob Marley and the Wailers. 6, thong bikinis. 5, snook and tarpon. Number 4, banana daiquiris. Number 3, it's a good excuse to get a new reel. Number 2, you get more frequent flyer miles. And the number 1 reason to go bone fishing is E equals MC squared, where E is your ecstasy, M is your mind, and C is a constant equal to the speed of bonefish squared. Whoa. Welcome, Dave Ames.
All right, well, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. It's great. So this is a story I just wrote for Big Sky Journal. Most of the stuff I write is about fishing because I can sell it. You know, and I've been thinking lately, I'd really like to try and write some other stuff, but it's so hard dealing with all these editors and, everything, so, I just know these people and you can just sell these stories. It's kind of the easy way out. I wrote this story, everything I do is, it's fiction, it's based on things that happened. And I resurrected a character from True Love and the Woolly Bugger called Julie the Rainbow Girl for this story. And it was funny because when that book came out, I was on this talk show back east on this radio thing, and I was talking with this guy, and it was every middle-aged guy's dream to know this, this woman that would be like Julie the Rainbow Girl. So we got through this whole thing, and finally I told him, I said, well, she doesn't really exist, that this was 3 different people I put together into one character. And this guy was so crestfallen, and he ran one of these big multi-megawatt AM radio station things, and he was just so disappointed. And that's when I realized that when you're writing these things that you really can't, if you create a fictional reality, you can't disabuse that notion. But I'm telling you ahead of time, I just made this up because I respect you. All right, so here it is. This is a story, I call it My First Boat. And it starts like this. I believe in clean living mostly as a way of making up for all the rest of the time. And half a lifetime ago, we were sitting around the commune washing down a brown rice casserole with cold beer and Jack Daniels. As usual, since Julie the Rainbow Girl had arrived on the scene, we talked fly fishing, and my friend Deke slapped his hand on the cable spool table so hard his whiskey sloshed. There's only 2 kinds of people in this world, he said. There's people that own boats, and then there's everyone else. The tattooed snake on Julie's leg flexed as she stood to clear the dishes. On a summer quest for Rocky Mountain trout before returning to her job as a 4th grade teacher in the Haight District of San Francisco, Julie was a little bit older than me and a whole lot wiser. Let me give you a piece of advice, she said. Never tell a biker they're like everyone else. You'll have to pull down your zipper to see where you're going. With her long red hair trailing behind her, Julie had been known to stop traffic on her chopped pink and chrome Harley as she sped by. I wasn't much more than 20, but I already knew that I didn't want to be like everyone else. It wasn't that I minded working. The problem was that jobs cut into time better spent fly fishing, a sport to which I had recently converted as a full-fledged zealot. As a fly fisherman, I could see the advantages of a boat. You could float to places that would otherwise be inaccessible. You could fish from angles that only a boat could provide. You could cover a lot of water. And of course, you could bring along a cooler. A boat is a life support unit. You can bring along all the essentials. You can even bring along some luxuries. You can put a lot of stuff on a boat, which is great, until you sink the boat, because then you not only lose your boat, you lose a lot of stuff. That's why you want to get a good boat. I was so young, I still thought love was free, but boats cost money. I hadn't worked more than a couple days in a row since the salmon flies had started coming, and that was months ago. I was down to my last 100 and change. It seemed like fate the next morning when the newspaper fell open to a picture of a raft beneath big block letters advertising a summer sale. The sale was at Sears, and $80 got you an 8-foot raft, dull yellow canvas tubes with a bright blue bottom and matching fringe. The boat came with a pump, but no rowing frame. I had life jackets and a cooler. Everything else I was going to have to scrounge. Oars were a problem. Good ones cost more than the boat. At the time I was living on the outskirts of Helena in some apartments that had been built on a mining claim dating back to the early days of Last Chance Gulch. I called it the Clancy Street Commune. The rickety sheds and dilapidated barn were full of rusted tools and old hardware. It was nothing a little WD-40 couldn't fix, except we didn't have WD-40 back then. I built a rectangular frame out of 2x4s salvaged from a chicken coop, complete with a rope sling to hold the cooler that doubled as a seat. If you wanted a beer, all you had to do was stand up. I was scavenging bolts in the shack against the hill that opened to the back on the dark hole of a deep adit when I came across the real score, a pair of 9-foot oars. It never occurred to me to wonder what a pair of oars was doing at the mouth of a mine shaft. Again, I thought it was fate. I whistled while I worked, sanding down the fuzz that coated the oars like thick gray peach skin. The oars came complete with oar locks. I drilled matching holes in the frame. A few pieces of rope to secure the frame to the thin tin grommets in the fringe of canvas that circled the raft like a blue plastic tutu, and voila, no longer was I like everyone else. I was a boat person. Where should we go? I asked. How about the bear trap? Said Julie. I hear it's fishing. Where's that? It's in the Madison River below Ennis. Sure, I said. My cheeks hurt. I was smiling so hard, but it was a simple case of ignorant bliss. I had no idea I'd just agreed to run what is arguably the most formidable rapid in Montana. At the time, I'd floated plenty, but only in canoes, an experience which is not directly applicable to rafting. You steer a canoe by going faster than the current, while you steer a raft by going slower than the current. In a raft, all your power is in the backstrokes. It's a difference that takes some time to work into your muscle memory. You should practice on a lake, not the kitchen sink. The kitchen sink is the biggest rapid in the Bear Trap Canyon. You'll hear it echoing off the canyon walls before you see it, like rolling thunder of an approaching storm. The roar gets louder and your heart throbs faster until finally you see it, a tumultuous chute of head-high standing waves and deep keeper holes. Cliffs and boulders crowd in from river left. We pulled out well above the rapid in an eddy on the right, alongside a couple of other boats, and then walked the limestone trail to the overlook where you scout the rapid before you run it. Hold on to your seats. We'd already been floating a couple of hours that morning. The fishing had been good for fat rainbow trout on green Matuka streamers. We'd run a couple of smaller rapids, screaming, yelling, and laughing as we chased hooked trout through the whitecaps. The new raft had performed admirably, but the kitchen sink was much tougher than anything we'd yet attempted. The waves were higher than the boat was long. Raft-eating rocks lurked left, right, and everywhere for the next quarter mile. Looking down, the truth is that I didn't want to run it, not in my new boat. Depending on flows, the kitchen sink is Class 4 and Class 5 whitewater. You can't just point the bow and go. You have to maneuver around obstacles that might kill you if you fail. First up in the kitchen sink is a rock ledge on the left. Then there's a huge boulder called Herb's Rock about dead center at the head of the big drop. Then there's a killer hole just below a nasty piece of limestone jutting up on river left. Julie pointed at the sharp rock with one hand and used her other hand like a megaphone. "Snaggletooth," she shouted. "Let's miss that one." I was thinking we should walk the boat down the shore, but Julie was ecstatic as a little kid naming rocks at the prospect of all that glorious danger. Her idea of a good time was riding a motorcycle 120 miles an hour with her eyes closed at night, and now she pressed in close so she wouldn't have to shout over the roar of the rapids. "I get so," she said. "You have no idea." To make sure I got the idea, Julie filled in the pause by running her tongue up my neck and into my ear. Sadly, we weren't alone on the lookout. Happily, the group included a professional river guide who, when asked, dispensed advice on how to best run the rapid. "Don't do it," he shouted. "Your boat's too small." Well, I could be a smart man, or I could just be a man. I have to do it. The guide nodded like he understood. Then aim for Herb's Rock. Let the pillow push you off the left. You can't hit the rock. The pillow is too strong. It seemed counterintuitive that you would purposely aim for the biggest rock in the river, but the guide was adamant. Cut Herb's close. As soon as you can, make a hard right. Get too far left, and the current will force you down into that killer hole on the left. That killer hole on the left was Snaggletooth. If aiming at the big rock would keep me away from Snaggletooth, I was all for it. I mapped out the route in my mind. Hold right, move left above Herb's Rock, but not too far left, then hard right. Back at the boat, Julie kicked us offshore and grabbed her rod. Don't fish, I said, not now. Julie looked at me like somebody had farted. Okay, she said, Dad. That was the first and last time I ever told Julie what to do. In retrospect, she may have had some father issues, but I had issues too. High crashing whitewater waves crept in from both sides as we shot the smooth green tongue. Julie was just flipping out line. She hadn't even really made a proper cast when a trout flashed up behind a rock and smashed the fly. Big water, she shouted, smiling again. Big fish. I never saw the fish as 6-foot waves converged in from both sides at once. I couldn't see out, not squatted down like a gnome on the 12-inch tubes of an $80 raft. Towering hills of whitewater soared up into a blue sky. That's all I could see. Herb's Rock was nowhere to be seen. Up front, fly rod still bent. It was worth a smile on her face as Julie clenched a yellow tube with her bare legs. We were soaking wet in a boat full of water and running blind. I remembered left, so I angled the bow of the raft to the right, then pulled back hard on both oars. The first stroke went fine. The second stroke went less well. So that's dry rot, I mused. It's funny what goes through your head. I'd always wondered how something could rot if it was dry. The honeycombed wood and the shattered oar told the story, and the broken blade dangled uselessly as a wall of black rock appeared dead ahead and the boat began to gain altitude. We were riding the surge that formed as thousands of cubic feet of water piled up against Herb's Rock every second. When it comes to rivers, no 2 seconds are the same. It's part of the fundamental nature of fluids. The only constant is change. In one instant, we were climbing high on the reverse pillow that built up and pushed back as it bounced off Herb's Rock. In the next instant, the water dropped out from beneath us. We didn't just hit Herb's Rock, we smashed it. Julie's legs scissored wide as she popped free of the tube, bounced once, and floated away, still holding her rod. I pitched forward face first onto the blue floor as the raft spun away on the next surge into the whitewater mountains, and led with my knees and elbows as we smashed hard up on what felt like the back of a stegosaurus. Snaggletooth. A keeper hole is usually a big drop, a place in the river where the water recirculates as it pours over a rock or a ledge. Get stuck in a keeper hole, round and around and around and around you go until the currents spit you out. You might be in there a couple of minutes, you might be in there a couple of hours. The recirculating hole in the backwash below Snaggletooth was deep, wide, and powerful. All that stood between me and a voyage into that black hole was the fact that I was impaled on a sharp rock. The frame and cooler tore away from the flimsy canvas fringe almost immediately, floated a few feet, then sank like stones into the hole. A heartbeat later, the blue floor ripped away. I grabbed at a tube and hung on by my armpits, the hole sucking at my dangling legs. It didn't take a rocket scientist to see what was coming. I just had time to take a deep breath when there was a sound like the quick pull on both triggers of a double-barreled shotgun as both tubes exploded. That's going to leave a mark, I thought as I was dragged face first down the spine of Snaggletooth, the deflated remains of my raft clenched firmly in my armpits. Up top, in the worst of the turbulence, you go where you're thrown. A couple of twisting somersaults and a back flip later, I was trussed and tied in a writhing yellow donut of flaccid, heavy canvas. My right arm was pinned to my side, both legs were wrapped. Only my head and left arm were free. The river in a big hole is as much air as water. It's a complete whiteout. You can't see, so you have to hear. The cold white hiss of bubbles against the background roar at the bottom of the river. Down by the background roar, that's the exit door. You can't fight the downward pull of a keeper hole. The closer you get to the surface, the stronger the force you're fighting. The way out of a keeper hole is at the bottom, where the recirculating effect is weakest. Since I didn't know that at the time, it was probably fortunate that I was wrapped in the raft. The advantage of the dead flapping weight of the canvas was that once I got to the bottom, I stayed at the bottom. The bottom of a whitewater river is moving, and every move makes a noise. It's a symphony of sound down there. The low bull roar of the keeper hole faded, replaced by the high-pitched beetle-like click of smaller rocks jostling in the main current. It seemed I was moving as I picked, poked, and prodded at whatever canvas I could reach with my left hand. It's just another tangle. How bad could it be? You see, if you fish with flies, you know something about tangles. Find a loose end, work your way back. Don't pull on anything so hard it cinches tight. It's a lot like life. Loosen as you go. Sometimes it's like magic, the way tangles spring apart. Undoing tangles is like finding inspiration. It helps if you think of something else. My first thought was that I should have bounced a check for a decent set of oars. What a stupid way to go. Then I thought at least I was running the rapid, although I wish my raft had a little more air in it. I wondered if Julie still had her fish. They say your whole life flashes before your eyes when you're drowning, but I was still stuck on Julie when my right arm popped loose. With both hands free, my legs quickly followed. Once I jettisoned the raft, my life vest popped me to the surface. I swam competitively most of my life, but that's about the longest I ever held my breath. I'd run the worst of the rapid underwater. Now it was just a matter of kicking to shore. Julie was fine. She caught a quick eddy and ended up on shore without even going underwater. Telling her story, she was smiling and laughing. Then suddenly her face clouded over with an expression conveying at least anger and perhaps rage. "There's only one thing that bothers me," she said. With her eyebrows furrowed, lips pursed, and arms crossed, Julie looked so schoolmarm serious and spoke so fiercely I didn't know what to think. "What's that?" I said. "I lost a fish," she replied. It wasn't that funny, but we collapsed on the rocks, laughing hysterically. The thing about nearly dying is that you're never so glad to be alive. Your perceptions are honed. The sky had never been so blue. Stinging nettles crowded in from both sides of the trail. The bushy thistled flowers had never been so purple. It was a hike of several miles out, and the spines on the needle-green leaves had never been so pointed. Not everybody is allergic to the alkaloids and nettles, but I am, and all I had to protect my bare skin was a life jacket, tattered cut-off jeans, and a single flip-flop. My legs were a solid mass of oozing red sores by the time we hiked out to the highway. The itch was terrible. Weeks later, I'd wake up with fresh blood on my fingernails and lie there awake, trying not to scratch, smiling at the thought of my next boat. Well, thank you very much. Well, like I said, everything's about fishing, so. But it's about more than just fishing. This is a story about Venezuela. And I wrote this story a while ago. I've been down there. It's probably been 8 or 10 years. And I just sold my house in Helen. I moved over to Little Blackfoot, and I bought this piece of property where there was this trailer on it. I was living in this trailer, and I thought I was dying. I was so sick, but it turned out that I wasn't dying. It was just that the sewage vent didn't go all the way out through the trailer, so the sewage gas was backing up into the trailer. So, I just wasn't getting enough oxygen, and the oxygen that I did get smelled. So I was really sick. I had a temperature like 104, and I went down to the doctor. He gave me this medicine, and I'd already bought my ticket to go down to Venezuela. I just got divorced. I was going to go down there just for a couple months and clear out my head. And I lost like 20 pounds. I was really sick. And one of the things I had planned was to go way up into the Amazon after these peacock bass, but it didn't work out because I was just so sick I couldn't do that. So that's just kind of the background to this story. I ended up in a place called, where was I? Ciudad Juarez on the Orinoco River. So it's a peacock bass. Peacock bass live in the mud-yellow Orinoco River of northern Venezuela. I knew that. I just didn't know where. The river was huge, a half-mile across. I needed a guide. And out on the water, brown-skinned men using baited hand lines and canoes hewn from the trunks of trees were catching up a kind of catfish with fat barbed whiskers. A thin man and a fat man in a canoe with flaking red paint were doing better than all the other canoes. They fished far enough away that the sound of the whack came as an echo of the sight as each catfish was clubbed to death with a wooden billy. I tracked them to shore and was waiting as their canoe ground on the rocky riverbank. Pavone, I said. Con mosca? Pavone is peacock bass. Mosca is fly, but it's more like a horse or a fruit fly than it is a clouse or minnow. The fishermen looked back over their flat noses like they'd been convicted of a crime they did not commit, and the conversation deteriorated from there. To clarify, I chopped my right arm up and down like I was casting a fly fisherman. Both fishermen flinched at the movement. Downstream, a pipe in the cliff spouted affluent onto a beach painted the same lichen orange as a geyser basin. A brown boy in a Chicago Bulls t-shirt appeared with a wheelbarrow. The thin fisherman began throwing fish up onto the rocks at my feet. The fat fisherman shook his head so hard his cheeks wiggled. No, senor, he said, no. I followed the wheelbarrow to an open-air restaurant perched on a rock bluff above the river. From a white plastic chair, I ordered fresh fish. 300 miles to the northwest, in the highland swamps and blackwater rivers that spawn both the Orinoco and the Amazon, lurked world record peacock bass. 50 feet to the east, a ragamuffin group of boys removed wool neck straps and dropped their wooden boxes of chicle and shoeshine tools. They were orphans, banded together, making their way in the world. The oldest was maybe 14, the youngest 5 or 6. They squeezed around the table, digging coins from their pockets. A waitress in tight pants, ending in points just below the knee, scooped up the money. Each boy received a plate heaped with rice and crowned with a single morsel of chicken. The boys bent to their food with quiet determination. I waved to the waitress and circled a finger at the table full of boys. Refrescos, I said. The bill for a round of bottled soda came to about $3, so I ordered the boys ice cream too. The waitress delivered the goods. In unison, the boys' hands clasped their pockets as if protecting their remaining coins. The waitress smiled and pointed at me. In that instant, I was surrounded by chattering boys. Tuchine, meester, gum. They were offering me what they had, but I was wearing sandals. No, I said, pavone. For a second, all the suddenly silent boys had the same look, the whites of their dark eyes so round in their sweat and dirt-streaked faces it was as if they'd forgotten how to be surprised. Then the biggest boy whistled to the dirtiest boy, who disappeared with his poppin' ice cream. The fish on my plate was reduced to picked-over bones and lemon rinds when the dirtiest boy returned with El Zopilote, a tall man with round shoulders who smiled with one gold tooth. El Zopilote means the buzzard, and his English was about as good as my Spanish. Yes, he was a fishing guide. Yes, he'd heard of fly fishing, but he'd never seen it done. Yes, he had access to peacock bass and private lakes that had only recently been opened up to fishing. If I went, I would be the first fly fisherman ever. It sounded good, but the problem with guides is that they're like tequila. The good ones don't come cheap. How much, I asked. For you, he replied. 600. A half hour later, I had it down to 200 a day. Even that was more than I had, but that's why God made credit cards. We left before dawn for the 6-hour drive. Wind ruffled green leaves in a hardwood grove as we stopped in front of a shack built entirely out of corrugated metal tied together with baling twine. Behind the shack, an 80-acre lake behind an earthen dam narrowed into a ravine, sprouting the stark skeletons of a drowned forest. A boy squatted on his haunches in the shadow of the rusted tin hut, eyes watering over a smoky fire that smelled of coffee grounds, tending to a can of beans roasting at a precarious angle to the coals. The boy, his name was Julio, stood up, gawky with newfound adolescence. Living in that shack, Julio had undoubtedly been after these bass all his life. I figured that he knew that lake like no one else alive. The buzzard spoke Spanish too fast for me to understand, pulled a cooler from the truck, showed his gold tooth in an absent-minded smile, and disappeared. A rickety dock spanned the cattail swamp that ringed the lake to a dented aluminum boat tilting under the weight of a giant outboard motor. In the cattails, the water made a sound like a watermelon falling. Julio pointed toward the splash. Pavone, he said. What do they eat, I asked. Julio shrugged. Maybe snake, he replied. There was another splash as we walked the plank deck. Another bass splashed 30 feet away as we climbed in the boat. I was incredibly excited and stripped off line to cast, but the motor started on the first pull. Without any warning at all, Julio twisted the hand throttle straight through forward and on into full speed ahead, and I toppled into the bottom of the boat. I saved the rod by sacrificing my elbow. Julio's eye gleamed. I'm not sure he even noticed I had fallen into the bottom of the boat. For the next 2 hours, we roared circles around the lake. Every so often, we'd stop and I'd cast, but our wake was pounding the shore. There was no way we could be successful. This wake had to be driving the bass into deeper cover. Uh-oh. I had not yet had a strike when the roar of the motor finally made me snap. "Enough!" I screamed. I reached up from where I'd fallen into the puddle in the bottom of the boat and yanked on the spark plug wire. The shock ran up my fingers and faded into the sweet silence. Waves still rocked the shore. Lunch would give both me and the lake time to calm down. Besides, I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday. I was starving as I opened the cooler. Beneath the iced beer, all I found was more ice. All we had for lunch was beer. Julio sat hunched on his plank seat with his elbows in his lap, staring at his dirty feet. How could a fishing guide have dirty feet? It was like he'd never caught a fish before in his life. It was like he'd never fished before in his life. And I stretched both hands to the turquoise sky that mantled the hardwood hills. "Were you born here?" I asked. His reply was unintelligible, muttered through the corner of his mouth. I asked him to look up and talk slower until finally I couldn't believe what I'd heard. Julio hadn't been born on that lake. He'd only been there 3 days. He was one of the shoeshine boys back in Ciudad Juarez. That's why they'd known him. He'd just been hired to work cheap. No wonder he couldn't boil coffee over a fire. The buzzard was at fault, and when I asked where the buzzard had gone, Julio grabbed both sides of the boat like he wanted to jump. "La Casa Chica," he replied. It translates as little house, but La Casa Chica really means love nest. A mistress is a Latin tradition, because without one, you can't be macho. So while the buzzard was rolling around in his sweet baby's arms, I was rolling around in the boat with a shoeshine boy. Julio wasn't a guide, but he showed he had promise, because he opened me another beer when he saw how quickly the first one had disappeared. It had been quiet long enough that the birds started singing again as the boat drifted before the wind toward the drowned forest and the inlet ravine. Gray skeletons of stout-limbed trees rose through the olive water into the blue sky as we bumped a polished trunk. A silvery frog disguised as dead wood jumped over the bow and into the lake. The frog turned green to match the lake water as it swam with strong leg kicks for the next tree over. Too slow. A turquoise and yellow flash erupted from the depths, and a fat fish like a pig with fins cannonballed back to the water a liter length away. The ripples of the death splash died away as I tied on a green and white deer hair popper with knotted rubber legs. On my first cast, the bass was fast, but not fast enough. I yanked the fly right out of his mouth. Do that to a trout, and they're gone for the day. Do that to a peacock bass, it just makes them mad. On my second cast, I hooked a fish, which jumped twice, wrapped a leader around a submerged limb, and broke me off. Every dead tree held fish, and I was surrounded by dead trees. I lost a lot more than I caught, because a balanced diet is not entirely beer. Without even water to drink, I was drunk, dehydrated, and pissing out of the back of the boat by the time the buzzard finally returned. "Did you have a good time?" he called out. He could tell just by looking at me the answer to that question. His smile tightened enough that his gold tooth disappeared, but only momentarily. Then the smile was back, twice as big as before. "Because the lake tomorrow," he called out. "She is so much better." I could have complained, but it wouldn't have done any good. South of the border, whatever happens, it's always somebody else's fault. If I complained, Julio would be back to shining shoes, and I still wouldn't have lunch tomorrow. I might not even see the other lake we were supposed to go to. On the other hand, Latin America is a land where irony is not lost. Irony is a way of avoiding insults when the macho code demands that honor be defended, and I shook my fist at the buzzard. "Tomorrow," I demanded. "We need more beer." Thank you very much. Da 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 da.
Thanks very much, Dave. Thanks. That was fantastic. Well, we will take a break. Did you bring any books? You forgot to bring any books. Well, I have one copy of... He is so astute. I have one copy of the Wollebugger if anybody wants to buy it. It's already signed. Let's take a break. Feed Haas's head, that ceramic device back there on that table to help support Naked Words. Keep it coming. And we'll be back here in a few minutes. Okay. Well, let's get this on the road then. Welcome, Krys Holmes.
I'm a little bit resentful that it took such a tiny piece of paper to introduce me. I haven't read this story for a little while, so it's going to be new to both of us, all of us. And it's my first time with reading glasses. I hope I look sophisticated. The name of this story is Warrior. The title I stole from my husband, the writer, Charlie Atkins. I received my first spider bite and had just finished choking on an apricot pit on the day that Genghis Khan rode into the Elkhorn Mountains. The spider bite formed a welt on my back, soon rubbed raw by the elastic waistband on my pants. We were staying at a cabin on Crystal Creek, a place to park the kids while my father visited my mother in the hospital in Helena, where she might die. From the porch of the painted log cabin, you could almost throw a stone all the way into the creek, where we got water. In those days, we'd never heard of Giardia. We drank from every stream. The stand of pines around the cabin opened up into a broad field where sunshine poured out of the sky and baked the dry grass, and where everything smelled like cattle and light. It was across this field that Genghis Khan came riding up on the most muscular little horse you ever saw, his scarlet robe billowing in the wind. He wore heavy black pantaloons and felt boots that turned up at the toes, just like old cowboy boots do. Over his shoulders flew a thick cape gathered across the front of his chest by fasteners that clinked and jangled. He dismounted and strode over to me. He carried a long staff that reached up toward the sky, and from it dangled a hoop with 9 ermine tails. The silver helmet on his head, decorated with cascades of fur, made him look taller than any other man, but his eyes were about level with mine. I was still thinking about the apricot pit. To me, apricot pits looked just like almonds, so I thought they were the same thing. But when I bit into the pit, the bitterness that came out made me gasp, and I sucked the pit into my throat and had spent the last few moments hacking it back out again. It was a moment you hoped nobody else saw. He grunted a little. Then the silence stood up between us like a third person. His eyes looked folded over, like seashells filled with black liquid. His face was huge and round, with high cheekbones and a big, fierce jaw, but a little fringe of crazy bangs poked out from his helmet kept me from being terrified of him. I'd been taught it was impolite to point or ask someone who they were, even on the telephone. Since that was the only question I could think of, I remained silent. He turned to his horse, untied a leather bag from its harness, held the bag up in front of the horse, and squirted some thick milk into the horse's open mouth. "What's that?" I asked. "Kumis," he grunted. His voice was deep as a bear's growl. "How'd you get him to do that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose at the horse, who stood with its mouth open to catch the fountain of curd. Thirsty, he said. I was blessed with the kind of childhood that contained few memorable moments. Such was its consistent happiness. As a result, I remember almost nothing of the past and choose instead to fill my head with terrors of the future. Otherwise, I am sure I would go mad with nostalgia. As a result, most of what I am telling you is false. The characters are real, but the details have been changed to protect myself. Except this. The afternoon my father called me inside from my play in the backyard of our eastern Montana house, and standing me between his knees said, "Your mother's been in an accident over in Helena." He looked deep into the backs of my eyes. "But everything's going to be all right. Broadside collision, broken back, internal injuries. Everything's going to be all right." "How old are you?" he asked. 11, I said. "How old are you?" 763, he announced, as though that number put every other fact in the world to shame. "What are you doing here?" I asked him. He planted the butt of his staff in the soft ground right next to a lupin, which shivered. He said, "Due to circumstances beyond my control," he cleared his throat, "I have just learned of this new land, a world beyond the edge of the world. I have come to conquer it." I said. I was thinking of my father. He was practically the only person in Montana who publicly protested the Vietnam War. He marched on Washington. He even marched on the Billings courthouse lawn when only 2 or 3 other people showed up. He was not going to like this. My father was at the hospital for the day. Mother was not doing well. In those days, they wouldn't admit children into the intensive care ward because children were a nuisance and had runny noses. I had not seen her for a month. "You and what army?" I said, looking at the cows in the field and the wooded hills beyond his ermine-lined shoulder. He thrust his shoulders back, and speaking with a great voice directed over my head, he said, "In the year of the blue fox, the shaman Kukch announced to the world that the everlasting blue sky, Monge Koko Tengri, had with his own hand raised up the noble Timujin, orphaned and deserted at birth, to the highest position among humans. On that day, the everlasting blue sky, Monge Koko Tengri, proclaimed the humble Temujin to be his representative on earth, Genghis Khan, universal ruler of the Yeke Mongol Ulus." "Where are your Yeke Mongol Ulus?" I asked politely. He looked at the ground. "Over the years they have scattered," he said. "I must call them together in a great Kurultai, a general assembly of the chieftains," he added, for my benefit. "Do you think they live near here?" I asked doubtfully. "I understand this is a land of great warriors," he said, sweeping his arm across the silent landscape full of cows and chokecherries and a few old logging roads. "I think all our soldiers are already at war," I told him quietly. "Where?" he demanded. "I shall join them. I will bring down into their presence the golden might of the great arm of the ruler of the universe." I thought the news that we were dropping bombs on Southeast Asia might offend the great Khan, who was Asian. So I simply said, "Boot camp somewhere?" "Soldiers," he spat, "are not true warriors. I seek the other, warriors of old who once ruled in splendor over the vast steppes of the Rocky Mountains." "Like the Blackfeet?" I squinted up at him. "Blackfeet," he pronounced. His mouth moved over the name like a hungry man chewing on a little snack that wasn't going to be filling, but better than nothing. "Piegan," I said. "Ah, Piegan," he said with more relish. I learned about the Blackfeet and all of Montana's other Indians in school. 50 miles off the Crow Reservation, all I knew of Indians I learned in books. Once in 4th grade, my teacher had told the class that if it wasn't for smallpox in the army blankets the military had sent upriver to the Indian camps, about half of us in the class would have probably been Blackfeet or Crow, and everyone groaned and said, "Ick." She also told us the real name for the Crow people was Absaluka, which meant children of the large-beaked bird. It probably meant raven, she said, but calling them Crow people made them seem less fearsome. "Maybe you are looking for the Absaluka," I said to Genghis Khan, trying to make the word sound fierce. "Absaluka!" he shouted toward the broad chest of Casey Peak, with his powerful jaws thrust wide open. The day of the accident, I was sent to my friend Robin's house to stay for a few days so Dad could drive the 250 miles to Mother's hospital room where she was about to have emergency surgery. I don't remember where my brothers, both older, were farmed out to. Robin's father was a minister like mine. When I walked into their living room and told Robin's father, Jack, that my mother had been in a car wreck in Helena and was about to have an operation, he yelled, "What?" and leapt to his feet. Until that moment, I believed my father's calm. Everything would be all right. After Jack made several phone calls, car accident, surgery, months in the hospital, nothing to do but pray, food, of course, and someone to take care of those kids. It dawned on me that these are the calls preachers make when someone's really in trouble. Nothing had ever really happened to me before. As I said, I'd broken my wrist in 3rd grade, and we almost lost our dog once, but we found it. My parents were the ones who took care of others, counseled wives who've been cheated on, took in troubled kids, moved us onto the floor so some itinerant or battered woman or kid applying for conscientious objector status could get a good night's sleep. Things happened to other people, and my brothers and I were not encouraged to ask what they were. Things never happened to us. I remember once lying on our back lawn, looking up at the dim blue eastern Montana sky and its small herd of unremarkable clouds. The grass itched the back of my legs. I looked straight up at the sky, and I tried to see everything my eyes could see, clear out to the edge of my peripheral vision, including the little fringe of my bangs and the vague hump of nose you can see in the lower corners if you concentrate. I tried to take it all in at once. I exist, I thought, for perhaps the first time. At one time I wasn't, and now I am. The sheer unlikeliness of being one of those accidents of nature that becomes a human being with thoughts at this particular place and time baffled me. I held my hand up and contemplated it against the sky. My hand with me inside it, and yet all that it indicated, the intricacies of bone and nerve and artery, its silent metamorphosis since infancy, this unique and personal grafting of my father and my mother seemed so far beyond my comprehension that my own hand began to look foreign to me, as though it and the sky and the earth below and the whole undiscovered universe were made of something divine and magical, and I was only peeking at them through wide open eyes. "What are you going to do?" I asked Genghis Khan. "I would like a drink of water," he said. Life at the cabin was simple and hard. We made it hard. We believed in the doctrine my brother Tim had read in the Gospel of the Red Man by Ernest Thompson Seton about the ways of Indians who, because they were persecuted, were practically saints. We had to walk silently through the woods without breaking any twigs, or if you stepped on a wildflower, you propped it up and apologized, so you could be one with all things. There was a little fireplace, but we didn't use it. Because if you wasted resources just to stay warm, what would make you strong when real hardship came? For the same reason, we washed our faces in the creek rather than heat water with propane. Once Tim and our oldest brother Steve went backpacking and at supper time wrapped their meat in an old leather bootlace they had found and cooked the little package over the fire. When it was charbroiled, they ate it, bootlace and all. They had inner fortitude. I tried in their presence not to be too much of a girl. For that reason, I was not about to show anybody my spider bite, no matter how much it hurt. Besides, the rising welt was irritated by the elastic of my underwear, and to show even a glimpse of white cotton to the boys was too shameful to think of. My father, of course, had other things on his mind. They had plucked shards of dark green glass out of my mother's forehead with tweezers after her sunglasses shattered against the car door. Of all her injuries, I thought that one the most horrible. The next time I saw Genghis Khan, he was out in the middle of the field lying underneath a cow, squirting milk from its teat straight into his mouth. I stood over him until his head emerged from beneath the cow, squinting up at me. He gave a little kick with both legs and leapt straight up onto his feet. He was smiling. His little round face looked grandfatherly, not like a Mongol barbarian at all. Little eyebrows danced far above his eyes. "Fat cows," he said. "Most awkward I've seen in the history of the world." "Yep," I said. "They look like it hurts them to walk," he said. "How do they pull your carts?" "They don't pull anything," I said. "They just sell them for meat." "Their milk tastes funny," he said as he walked back to his pony. "I expect it's the grasses here." "Why do you rattle?" I asked him. He grinned and parted his cape, which was fastened all across the top of his chest and then hung freely almost to the ground. It was made of thick felt trimmed with silk and white fur. On a leather belt inside his cape dangled an entire arsenal of wicked-looking weapons. He pointed at them one by one. "Shashpar, Piazi, Kistin, Kabarzin." He named off his array of maces and spears. He also carried a saber, a lance, a quiver with some strange-headed arrows, and a fishhook made of bone. Then he said, "Aha!" and retrieved from a belt behind his back an enormous battle axe. "Baltu," he said reverently. "Could I see?" I asked, pointing toward his quiver of arrows. I hoped he would give me one. He selected an arrow, dropped one shoulder out of his cape, shrugged a short bow off that shoulder and into his left hand, and in one gesture swept the arrow back into the bow and let fly. The arrow cut across the sky, emitting a terrifying scream. Genghis Khan laughed and pointed at a series of tiny holes carved in the tails of his other arrows. "To panic the enemy," he said. "Listen." He whipped another arrow into the bow and shot it. This one whistled low, like a mourning dove. I looked at the round-cheeked warrior. "This one signals all the other arrows to follow it straight to its target," he said. Then he trotted off across to the far hill to retrieve his arrows. I thought of the little town of Helena nearby and my mother lying helpless in the hospital. "Are you going to wreck our town?" I asked Genghis Khan when I caught up to him. "Because there's an Air Force base nearby." Immediately his smile disappeared and his eyes went cold. "Mongrel pigs," he said. "I have seen those cowards fly overhead like shrikes and drop their weapons behind them and fly off again. Karachu!" he spat. "A true warrior, a bagatur, looks his enemy in the face. Your modern warriors are not fighting each other. They are trying to destroy the land beneath each other's feet. They only maim each other. They leave great gaping holes in the land. Do you see these?" He pointed at an enormous six-flanged mace hanging from his belt. "Shashpar," he said. "All my weapons leave a mark only at the point of contact." He closed his cape and turned down the corners of his mouth, exhaling through his nose. "I am a bagatur, son of a bagatur, champion among civilized men," he said. "What about the catapult?" I said. "Didn't the Mongols invent that? That's a long-distance war machine. What about gunpowder? "Given to us by God," he bellowed. "If the mountain of life from which all rivers flow chooses to make us stronger than our enemies, to have dominion over all the world, who are we to argue?" I looked at the ground. "But destroy the fields and farmlands? Burn towns to the ground?" he went on. Then he took his own helmet off and looked at the ground too. "Those things I have done in my ignorant youth," he confessed with some remorse. "But not since the year 1222, when I was taught by my Muslim advisors that it is the farmers and the craftsmen who comprise the life-blood of a civilization by their diligent toil, have I committed such barbaric acts. For 746 years, I have righted my ways." "That doesn't really count," I said quietly. "You're dead. Technically." "Ah," he said, and shoved his tortoise-shell face into my face. "You know about death?" I bit both my lips together and watched a carpenter ant scale a long blade of grass until it bent over and dropped the ant onto the ground. "What do you know about death?" he demanded, planting his standard in the earth like a challenge. I squinted to keep my eyes from filling up with tears. "I know that people are only alive a short time," I said. "That before you are born you are not alive, but you are waiting to be alive and hoping that you will get to. And after you die..." "After you die, what?" he asked me in his growling voice. But my chin gave way and the tears burst out and I ran. Down the slope, leaping over gopher holes, I ran, as fast as a mongrel pony dashing across the steppes. The blurred world jiggled before me, and behind me, horses' hoofbeats closer and closer. Suddenly his great scarlet sleeves swept around me, and he lifted me off the ground and over the flank of his horse, and with his harness bells jingling and the wind whistling through my ears and the smell of horse sweat rising up, we rode and rode and rode. "What else can you see from where you are?" I asked him. "Besides the Air Force dropping bombs on little children and the forgotten warriors of North America." "Ho!" he said. It was a kind of grunting exhalation. "The sun started to go down. Everything I trained my eyes to see in life, I continue to see in death," he said. "Strategies of war, patterns of agriculture, loyalty wherever it abides, new ways to increase strength, and the happiness or unhappiness of my people." "Are your people happy?" I asked, thinking of Life magazine photos of hundreds of Chinese children in gray pajamas lined up in perfect rows. "My people," he said proudly, "will always be happy because they have befriended their own death. Once you have befriended death, nothing can harm you. It is my greatest legacy." I squinted into the setting sun. "Sounds morbid," I said. "I think we're supposed to love life." Genghis Khan reached over and tore a button off my shirt. "Hey," I said, "give that back, it's mine." "No," he said, "it's mine now. I am more powerful than you. I have taken it away from you, and it will never again be yours. Even if I give it back to you, you will only be borrowing it from me." I looked at him like, "You're crazy." "A thing is only truly yours if it can never be taken away from you," he said. "Every warrior knows this. If you fear death, then whoever threatens to kill you holds your life in his hands. Then you are very vulnerable, and forever you are only borrowing your life from whoever wants to kill you." "Nobody wants to kill me," I said. "Your death is always at hand," he said. "You could choke or freeze or eat a bad mushroom or get hit on the head. Always, your death is right behind you, trying to trip you up." "How can you be friends with that?" I said. I thought about my spider bite. "When we are young boys training for battle, we fight against our best friends," Genghis Khan said. "Everyone knows you see the enemy only through your own weakness, but through love you see your friend's weakness clearly, and so in battle you take advantage of it. You become his greatest teacher, and he yours." Genghis Khan, who had been lying back with a stalk of timothy grass between his teeth, sat up and looked directly in my eyes. "You must face death squarely, as though it were your best friend, he said. You must give your whole life to your death. We're supposed to give our life to God, I said. Same thing, he said. If God is life, then God is death also. See, nothing to be afraid of. Slap it on the back. Give it a wink. Once you make friends with death, your life will be your own, and no one can ever take anything away from you. Hee-hee! He rolled onto his back and kicked his feet in the air, and it scares the hell out of your enemies, he said. After a moment, he rolled up onto one elbow and said, that is the reason my people are happy. That, and of course, we always tax the wealthy according to their wealth so as not to overburden the merchant and craftsman, who are the lifeblood of any economy. Of course, I had to walk home. It was a long way. Your shoes untied, Steve said as I came up the path to the cabin. He let the screen door slap shut behind him and sat on the step. Dad's here. Inside, my father was stacking up firewood by the hearth for the next guests to use. Tim was stirring some glop over propane. Nice of you to stop by, Crystal, Dad said. It's not my name, but his name for me. I heard the jokey part at the beginning. It was many years before I would hear that when he gave the Y a two-syllable sound, it meant he was upset and trying not to sound like he was. He said that the following day we would get to go visit our mother. No, she wasn't much better. He looked at each one of us in turn. It might be your last chance for a while, he said. His voice was soft and strong. His own mother had died when he was 10. She was taken to the hospital, died there, and buried, and he never saw her again. My father will be saying goodbye to her forever. But it won't be easy on you, he said. She's very sick. Needles, pumps, loud machines, tubes down her throat so she can't talk, scars and bruises everywhere so we can't hug her or squeeze too hard. Very fragile, even after a month, but thank goodness not on the stomach pump anymore. The cabin took on a solemn air, as though we were facing a grave danger or about to receive a great award. There was no kidding around. Over dinner, we said positive things, trying to make each other feel better, mostly trying to make Dad feel better, because the better he felt, the more faith we had in what might happen. We told him about adventures we'd had at the cabin in those few days, clever things we'd done to outwit the squirrels or sabotage the entropy that plagues an unused place out in the living landscape. When the talk ground down, he'd say, "What else?" and we'd start up again. That night in my bunk, I thought about a sky full of Genghis Khan, and if he felt small coming back to Earth again. I thought maybe I could show my bug bite to my mother, and even if she couldn't talk, or maybe she could write me a note to tell me what to do for it. There are things mothers do everywhere. Many they do with the backs of their hands, sweep hair out of their faces, push on the warm water faucet, open the refrigerator door, because so often their hands are full or wet or sticky. I practiced using the backs of my hands for things. I learned how to tuck the phone to my ear by crooking my shoulder. I even said, "We'll see," though without authority. In that time, I practiced these things. In the morning, I woke up feeling important and older than I was. We got in the car silently and drove in silence to the hospital. When we did speak, we spoke quietly as though we were in church. We tried to make our footfalls silent on the long wooden floors of the hospital hallway. Our father led us gently. He tried to act like he was not in a hurry to get there. He stopped us outside a closed door. "Are you ready?" he asked us. We all nodded silently. He pushed the door open and we stepped in. First, a smell of camphor and alcohol, of body odor and blood. Tubes running into and out of the bed gurgled and spat, their machines whirring and choking and pumping rhythmically. Tiny wisps of hair splattered against a pillow, and beneath it all, a small spider-like body that perhaps belonged to my mother. Tubes ran into her nose, her mouth gaped open in an expression that looked like an old woman near death. We all stood back from the bed. I've brought the children, my father said to her, caressing her white and tiny forehead. She strained to open her eyes, strained to shift her focus to the side to see us. She grunted. Stand over there where she can see you, he told us. My brothers and I shifted positions in tiny unison steps. Her hand lay on the bed. My mother's hand lay on the bed. An IV tube was bandaged to it, but it was my mother's hand. I reached for it and put it against my face. My mother's hand smelled funny, but it felt the same as always. Her face looked gray and bandaged and awful, but her hand was the same. I bent my face down into the cup of her hand and I whispered into her palm, Mommy, I have a spider bite that hurts and itches at the same time. I want you to come home. Suddenly, the machine that clicked and whirred beside her bed began to gallop. It galloped like the steed of Genghis Khan as he raced across the pasture. I heard the galloping, and I looked up at the machine. I think I saw that in that moment that my mother was a warrior too, racing across some pasture of her own. I began to see that only a small part of my mother remained there in the bed, and that some bigger part of her was engaged in a battle we could not see, and was galloping and galloping. The machines stared blankly down at her from her bedside. She also did not blink. She is not dying, I thought. She is looking death in the eye, and after that, she will come home. Why so silent? I asked Genghis Khan that afternoon. We were sitting by the creek, and Genghis Khan was dipping his enormous round toes into the cool water over and over. No, why so silent? Asked Genghis Khan that afternoon. Sorry. Thinking about my mom, I said. I threw a grass blade into the wind, and it blew right back and stuck in my hair. I squinted up at Genghis Khan from where I lay. His round warrior's face looked soft and sad. Are you going to cry? I asked him. Yes, said Genghis Khan. I am going to cry out in a voice the seven heavens can hear. I am going to cry for my people and for all warrior people, because there are no more warriors alive on the earth. Everyone of merit has been killed off, vanquished, or destroyed. What are you talking about? I asked him. I have been to the land of the warrior people, said Genghis Khan, the Absaluka, whom you call the Crow. I went there with honor. I gave them audience with dignity. I proffered myself as their advocate, their great father, and of course, their conqueror. For what greater honor could I bestow on a noble warrior people but to be conquered by someone as great as me? Genghis Khan's head fell against his chest and waggled back and forth. But there are no more warrior people, he said. Even the mighty Absaluka, they have been conquered by something so foreign to themselves they had no hope of fighting it. It has torn them from their own heritage. Genghis Khan's head fell to his chest. No one cares about warriors anymore, he said. I might as well go home. Don't worry, I told him. Maybe their time hasn't come yet. One day they will be strong enough to fight you, and then you can be happy again. I looked deeply into the backs of his eyes. Everything will be all right, I told him. Genghis Khan looked at me. His eyes were black stones behind buttonholes, gleaming. Children, he spat. The only creatures on earth braver than warriors. Genghis Khan peeled a blade of grass out of my hair. He held it between his thumbs and blew hard, making a wheezing whistle that lofted on the wind. In a moment, his meaty little horse cantered up, its war regalia shimmering in the afternoon sun. Genghis Khan pulled on his felt boots, leapt astride his horse in a graceful arc, righted himself smoothly, and galloped off across the pasture, bellowing some ancient gibberish. I watched him almost fly across that hillside, his horse taking barbed wire fences in long leaps, scarlet robe billowing behind him, his voice gusting across these spaces in whoops and cries. Soon he was just a dot on the horizon, still galloping. That night, my spider bite began to ache fiercely. Finally, fear overcame shame, and I decided to ask one of my brothers to look at it. I chose Tim because, though Steve was older and knew more, Tim spent all his time outdoors and probably had been spider bit himself. I considered him almost an Indian. He was so knowledgeable about outdoor survival. He might even know an ancient Indian remedy made of charcoal and spit and pine sap or something. I waited till he was brushing his teeth out on the porch of the cabin, spitting into the weeds. He liked the way the toothpaste glowed a little in the dark after you spit it. But he was careful to pour his swishing water over it because you should always leave nature the way you found it. "Would you look at something?" I asked him timidly. "What?" he said. I handed him a small flashlight. Though the cabin had electricity, it was considered sissy not to rough it without. I pulled down the waistband of my pajamas and bent my spine around so we could both look at the funny-shaped welt topped with 2 bright red dots. "Spider bite," he said. "On your butt," he snickered. "Not on my butt, on my back," I said. "What do I do about it?" He looked at me, considering. "It'll probably go away," he said. "But it hurts and itches at the same time," I whined. "Okay," he said. "The thing you do is rub it really, really hard. The harder you rub it, the faster it'll go away." I thought about this. A remedy that required stoic discipline in the face of pain. It made sense. He handed me the flashlight back and turned to go into the cabin. "You can't die from spider bites, can you?" I asked quietly. "Don't be stupid," he said. It is advice I have tried my best to follow all the years of my life.